The second night of my marriage, I said no, not loudly, not with anger. I said it the way a girl says it when she has been taught her whole life that her no does not carry the same weight as other people's yeses. I said it quietly, with my face turned toward the wall, my hands folded under my cheek, the quilt pulled up to my chin. I said it the way I had been taught to say everything that mattered in my world, sideways, softly, hoping it would land without needing to be repeated. It was not enough. And what happened next was not a secret in my community. It was not hidden. It was not even considered wrong by a single person in my district, including the women who had survived the same rooms before me. There is a word for it in the understanding of Amish marriage, though no one ever says the word directly. There is a teaching for it, carried inside the theology of wifehood like water carried in cupped hands, carefully, without spilling, passed from one generation to the next. That teaching was spoken from the bishop's mouth in sermons that women sat through on hard wooden benches with their babies sleeping across their laps. What happened to me on the second night of my marriage had a name, and that name was husband's right. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in eastern Ohio, the second of 7 children, in a white farmhouse with green shutters and a garden that was my mother's entire world between May and September. I left when I was 26 years old, after 8 years of marriage, 3 children, and one morning when I stood at the kitchen sink watching the water run and understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes when something inside you has finally gone completely quiet, that I would not survive another decade inside that life. If you want to hear the things we were never permitted to say out loud, subscribe now and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, did you know this teaching existed? In any community, religious or not? I read every single comment. Everyone. Now let me explain what I mean by husband's right, because I need you to understand that this was not a dark secret buried somewhere in our doctrine. This was not something whispered. It was openly held. It was theology passed down through hundreds of years of plain community life. And it sat inside our understanding of marriage the way the foundation sits inside a house, invisible from above, holding everything up. In my community and in most Old Order Amish districts across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, marriage is understood as a covenant between a man, a woman, and God. The Ordnung, the unwritten code that governs every aspect of Amish life, from the width of a hat brim to the color of a buggy to how long a woman's hem must fall. The Ordnung says almost nothing explicit about what happens inside the marriage bed. It does not need to. The sermons do that work instead. The expectations travel through other channels. Through the women who hand each other coffee without looking up. Through the friend who says, "Over canning jars, you learn to live inside it." The teaching went like this. A wife's body, upon marriage, becomes a shared responsibility between herself and her husband. Her husband is responsible for leading the household. She is responsible for submitting to that leadership. And submission, Gelassenheit, yielding, was the highest virtue a woman in my community could demonstrate, higher than intelligence, higher than her own physical strength, higher than her comfort, and far higher than her preferences. The teaching did not say a wife could never refuse. It made room for illness, for genuine physical incapacity, a difficult birth, a fever. But it held, implicitly, and sometimes explicitly depending on which bishop stood at the front of your church district, that a wife who refused twice without cause was not fulfilling her covenant, and a husband who insisted after 2 refusals was not committing a wrong. He was exercising the order that God had established when he placed the husband as the head. He was, in the language my community used, leading. I was 19 years old when I married Jonas. He was 23. He had a good reputation in our district, hardworking, quiet, respected by the men. His father was a deacon, which in our world carries a weight that is hard to explain to people who have not lived inside a community where a man's family name is a kind of credential. When Jonas had come to Bundle during our courtship, he had been gentle. He asked before he reached for my hand in the darkness of my childhood bedroom. He told me once, lying still under my grandmother's quilt, that he was nervous too. I believed him. I thought that nervousness was the same as kindness. I understand now that it is not. Nervousness and kindness look similar from a distance. Up close, in the dark, they feel very different. I was wrong about Jonas. Not entirely. He was not a cruel man in the ways cruelty usually announces itself. But I was wrong about what his nervousness meant. And I learned the difference on the second night of my marriage. The wedding had been a Tuesday in October, 312 people, because my mother counted the plates. The ceremony lasted nearly 4 hours on those hard benches, the bishop preaching about wifehood and yielding, about the woman who fears the Lord, about the order God had established from the beginning of creation. I sat in my new cape dress, dark blue, the color brides wore in our district, and I remember thinking that I felt like I was being handed a set of instructions I had not yet been allowed to read. The wedding meal came after. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes with thick brown gravy, creamed celery, date pudding. The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and women who had been cooking since before dawn. My cheeks hurt from smiling. My feet had gone numb inside my shoes 2 hours before. By the time Jonas and I were finally alone, and the door of the small bedroom in his parents' house closed behind us, I was so far past exhausted that I barely registered what the first night required of me. I remember almost nothing of it except the horses shifting in the barn below, and the sound of Jonas's breathing changing, and the feeling afterward of staring at the ceiling and thinking, that is what this is. The second night was different. I was rested enough to be afraid. Not afraid of Jonas in the way that word sounds from the outside. Afraid of the room itself. Afraid of what I now understood the room required of me. The first night had made clear that this was going to hurt in ways no one had thought to prepare me for, ways that I would be expected to absorb in silence and call marriage. The second night, I lay in that dark room and I made a decision that felt, in the moment, like an act of self-protection. When Jonas reached for me, I said no, quietly, with my face toward the wall. He went still. I could feel the stillness of him beside me, the way the whole room seemed to hold its breath. The lamp was already turned down. The dark was almost complete. He said, "Are you unwell?" I said, "No, I am not unwell. Not tonight." He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I began to think he had accepted it. Long enough that I had started to let my shoulders come down from where they had been living, up near my ears, braced. And then he said 5 words. He said them calmly, without anger, the way you state a rule you did not write yourself, and therefore carry no personal responsibility for. He said, 1 more night is permitted. I did not understand, lying there in that room, that he was referencing something real. I did not know there was a teaching that had given him those exact words, that the concept of permitted refusals had been threaded into his understanding of marriage as thoroughly as it had been threaded out of mine. I thought it was simply Jonas, his personality, his expectation. It took me 8 years and a therapist and a library card in the English world to understand that Jonas had not invented what he was carrying into that bedroom. He had been handed it, shaped by it, the same way I had been shaped into my silence. The third night, he did not ask. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is what the years after that third night looked like. I want you to understand something about Jonas that I have spent a very long time working to hold correctly in my mind, because getting it wrong in either direction does not serve the truth. Jonas was not a monster. He did not believe, not for one moment, that he had done something wrong. Not because he was lying to himself. because the framework inside which he had been formed, the framework our entire community operated inside, had never once introduced the possibility that he might be wrong. He had been taught that leadership meant responsibility. That responsibility meant taking what the covenant entitled him to take once a wife had been given her permitted refusals. He was, inside his own understanding, fulfilling his role, being the head. The women in my community knew about the teaching. They knew it without ever speaking it plainly. It moved through the community the way all forbidden knowledge moved in our world, sideways, in code, in the spaces between sentences that were never completed. My mother-in-law, on the morning after my wedding, had brought me a cup of coffee and set it on the kitchen table without meeting my eyes. Just the cup, no words. But the particular way she did not look at me. I understood it the way women in our community learned to understand things that were never stated directly. She was telling me she had survived the same rooms. She was sorry in the only way she was permitted to be sorry, which was quietly with coffee, without eye contact, and without ever saying the thing she was actually saying. My friend Rachel had married 2 years before me. We had grown up together, seated side by side at Sunday services since before we were old enough to understand the sermons. She never told me directly what her early marriage had been. But one morning, about 3 months after my wedding, we were canning tomatoes together in her kitchen, both of us working without speaking the way women who have known each other a long time can work, and she said something without looking up from the jars. She said, "The first year is the hardest. You learn to live inside it." That was all. She did not look up. I did not ask what she meant. We kept working. I understood exactly what she meant. That was the whole conversation. The entirety of what 2 women in my community could offer each other about what had been done to us and what would continue to be done. A single sentence over canning jars. You learn to live inside it. I did learn to live inside it. For 8 years I learned it. I had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. I learned the geometry of my own compliance. I learned which nights Jonas was more likely to leave me alone and which he was not. I learned to be visibly exhausted at the right moments, and present at the moments where presence was safer. I learned the architecture of a life built around surviving the thing I was not permitted to name, the thing I was not permitted to refuse more than once, the thing that had a theological justification and a bishop's endorsement, and 300 years of tradition behind it. I learned to live inside it. And then one morning I stood at the kitchen sink, and I understood that living inside it was not actually living. It was surviving. And that surviving had a cost that was compounding in ways I could feel in my body and my children, and the distance growing behind my own eyes when I looked in the hand mirror Jonas had not yet replaced with one that didn't show the whole face. Leaving cost me everything the community defines as everything. The shunning came within weeks of my departure, which I had expected, which did not make it easier. My parents could not come to me, the Ordnung prevented it, and my parents were not people who knew how to exist outside the Ordnung. Jonas was granted primary arrangement of the children, which is the standard outcome when a wife leaves without grounds the church recognizes, and the church does not recognize the grounds I had. I did not fight it as hard as I might have. I did not know yet the words that would have helped me fight it. I did not know that what had happened to me in that dark bedroom on the 3rd night of my marriage had a name outside Amish theology, a harder name, a word I had never once heard spoken in my district. I learned it in therapy. My therapist was a woman who had spent her career working with people leaving high-control religious communities. She asked careful questions, and she did not hurry past the answers. When I described the 3rd night and the teaching behind it, and the 5 words Jonas had said in the darkness, "One more night is permitted," she let the silence sit for a long moment before she responded. Then she said, "Martha, what you are describing is marital rape." I remember exactly what the room felt like when those words entered it, how still everything went. I remember thinking, that is not a sentence I have any framework for. I have never heard those 2 words placed next to each other. And then, underneath that, Another thought. And yet it fits. It fits the precise shape of what I have been carrying in my body for 8 years. She said, "This is not uncommon in high-control religious communities. The theology varies, but the mechanism is the same. The wife's consent is framed as something that belongs to the covenant rather than to her. You are not alone in this. You were never alone." That last sentence destroyed me and rebuilt me inside the same breath. You were never alone. Rachel was not alone. My mother-in-law was not alone. Every woman who had ever received the morning coffee without eye contact and understood what it meant, every woman who learned the geometry of her compliance because it was the only architecture the community offered her, every woman who said no quietly in the darkness and was told that one more night was permitted, none of them were alone. There were thousands of them, across districts, across states, across generations of plain community life in America. Sitting on hard wooden benches while bishops preached about yielding, handing coffee to their daughters-in-law without looking up, saying, over canning jars, you learn to live inside it, and watching the next generation of young wives receive those words and carry them forward. They were not alone. The silence was designed to make them feel like they were. The silence was the mechanism. The silence was how it continued, without being examined, without being questioned, without anyone from inside the community ever standing up in a church service and saying plainly, "This teaching is producing harm, and we need to look at it directly, because the structure punishes the person who speaks before it punishes the harm." That is how the silence sustains itself. I want to tell you what my therapist helped me understand about why I had stayed silent for so long, even after I began to understand that something had been wrong. She said, when you have grown up inside a system where naming the harm is a greater transgression than committing it, your nervous system learns to protect you by swallowing the name. The silence is not weakness. It is the adaptation of someone who learned, very young, that speaking certain truths carried a cost she could not afford to pay. Leaving the system does not automatically dissolve the adaptation. It has to be unlearned, carefully, one word at a time. I am still unlearning. I want you to know that. I am 3 years out of that community, 2.5 years into therapy, and I am still finding silences inside myself where the words should be, places where my mouth knows to stop before my mind has decided to. The formation runs deep. The Ordnung does not stop at the fence line of the community. It travels inside the people who carry it out. My therapist said something else I have thought about almost every day since she said it. She said, a system that cannot survive a woman telling the truth about her experience inside it is a system that depends on her silence to function. The silence is not a side effect. The silence is the structure. The Ordnung depends on silence, not the written rules. There are not many of those. The unwritten ones. The ones that travel through coffee and averted eyes and a single sentence over canning jars. The ones that tell a wife she has been given her permitted nights and now the covenant requires her compliance. Those rules live in the silences between the words anyone is willing to say out loud. I am no longer inside that silence. And I want to speak now very directly to anyone watching this who knows the room I have been describing. Not the specific room. Your room. Whatever dark room you learned to live inside, whatever geometry of compliance you built for yourself, whatever name your community used for the thing that was done to you, your no was real. Every time. The first night and the second night and every night after. No theology makes a no into a yes. No bishop's sermon, no covenant language, no tradition 3 centuries old, no concept of shared responsibility. Your no was a complete sentence every single time you said it, and the fact that it was not received as one is not a reflection of your no. It is a reflection of the room. If you grew up in a place where your body was framed as a shared responsibility that you had not fully agreed to, I see you. If you learned to time your exhaustion to protect yourself, and you are only now understanding that strategy for what it was, I see you. If someone handed you something without words, And you understood exactly what they were telling you, and you kept working, and you never said a word because there were no words you were permitted to say. I see you. You were not failing at marriage. You were not failing at faith. You were surviving inside a structure that was built to make survival look like virtue. And that is not a small thing. Surviving is not a small thing. It is everything. When everything is what it costs you. The difference between surviving and living, I have learned, is the words. The ones they did not give us. The ones the Ordnung did not contain. I am spending every day now learning them and passing them to anyone who is ready to receive them. Because the silence only functions if enough of us stay inside it willingly. I am done staying inside it. And you do not have to either.